things done in the midnight sun by the men who roiled for gold. The Arctic trails hold their secret tales that will make your blood run cold. For those of you who are aware of the writing of Robert Service, that is the first section of his poem, The Cremation of Sandy. Robert Service was born in 1874 in Scotland. And he, as a young boy, he was totally into adventure novels, much like young boys are. And he just couldn't get enough. He was a voracious reader, but anything with action adventure, that was something that really, really got him going. However, school for him was not of any interest. As a matter of fact, school wasn't terribly interested in him either, because he didn't really pay too much attention. He wanted to be outside doing adventurous things. So at the age of 14, if you will, he became a bank apprentice for the Bank of Scotland. And he worked there until he was 22 years old, and he had a great life, but in the back of his head, there was always this bit of adventure that he wanted to experience. And so at the age of 22, he decided that he was going to head to the wilds of Canada. And in Canada, he was heading directly to Vancouver Island. That's where he wanted to be. So when he arrived here, life was maybe a little bit harder than he had expected. He'd been working as a banker for many years, and now he had a little bit different environment to be working in. So he got here and he got a job on a farm up in Duncan. He worked as a storekeeper for a period of time, but there wasn't much adventure, and it was just a little tougher than he thought. So he headed down the west coast, and he went down as far as Mexico even, and he had many, many different types of jobs. He worked as a farm laborer. He worked as a tutor in a brothel. He worked as he didn't work, but he was a hobo, and he also was a troubadour, and he actually sang to feed himself. And a number of years later, the allure wasn't hitting, and he made his way back to Vancouver, and he was down to almost his last bit of money. He was in Vancouver, and he was sitting on a street in downtown Vancouver, and he was really quite despondent, and he ran into a fellow who was a biscuit salesman who he had known from his time as a shopkeeper. And the biscuit salesman said, well, you have this banking experience. Why don't you go and apply for a job at the bank? So they were right outside the CIBC branch in downtown Vancouver, and Robert Service said, well, you know, in my pocket, I have a letter of recommendation from my banking experience in Scotland, but I can't go in looking like this. So he took his last pennies and he bought himself a decent suit. He went into the bank and he applied for a job. And of course, he got the job, but it was in Victoria. So over he comes to Victoria, and currently the CIBC building is still on the corner of Fort and Government Street, and is now known as the Barnum Banker, and it's named for Robert Service. So Robert went to work for the bank in 1903, but he arrived here. He'd spent all his money on his last suit. He really didn't have anything, so they offered him to, in addition to his clerking job, they allowed him the opportunity to work in security. So along with the security position, he was given a room, and the room was over the bank vault in the bank building. And so his job was to protect the vault in the bank when he was available, and this gave him a lovely room. Well, now this brought him back up to a point where now he has a good style of living again. He loved to dress, very nice looking man. If you've seen the pictures of him in the Barnum Banker, he was a very nice looking man. Very stylish, liked to dress, loved to sing, was the life of the party. And so he got very involved in the society and living on top of the bank vault. So he would go on a Friday evening to the parties, and the parties were down at the Union Club and then down at the Empress. And the only thing with his accommodations was that if he was to head out the front door of the bank and down Government Street, he would have to walk by the building, the establishment next door, which was the BC Funeral Furnishings Home. It was a funeral parlor, and it really bothered him a lot. So he would tend to go a whole block out of his way to end up down at the Empress and get back. So he would do this typically, but one night, January 8th, 1904, he was heading out and the weather was foul. It had been bad for months, but this was the worst night ever. And so he headed off and it was fine going down, but when it came time to come home, it was just awful. He was holding his coat around himself and he was being buffeted around by the wind and the rain was coming down and he thought, oh, forget this, I'm heading straight up Government, it doesn't matter. And so he heads on his path and he's going straight down Government Street and he's getting closer and closer and he's starting to feel quite uncomfortable as he gets closer to number 52 Government Street, which is the funeral parlor. And as he's walking by, he gets close to the door and here it is slightly ajar. And really creeps him out, but he's thinking, no, we're right next door to the bank. What if someone is in there trying to get into the bank from the business next door? So very gingerly, he sneaks in the front door and he just gets a few footsteps in and he can hear voices at the back and he can see her lantern light. So he takes a few more steps in and then he goes, oh, there's something going on here. I'm gonna have to do something. I better get back and either get help or I'm going to need to get my gun, which is next door. So he turned on his heel, but he tripped over something and he went flat down on his face. And he can feel this thing that's wet and clammy. And he feels around and he realizes it's a dead body. Not too long after, Robert Service found out that there had been a shipwreck. A ship coming from Port Townsend had wrecked off the coast and 56 people were killed. And that's what the men were doing in the funeral home. They were bringing the bodies in. And not more than a couple months later, Robert Service had transferred his work from the CIBC branch in Victoria to the CIBC branch in Kamloops. So fast forward to September 1958. A woman, she was an artisan, a weaver, and she had a studio on Government Street. And her studio looked across the street at the CIBC branch. And she was looking out one day and she had kind of a weird feeling and she looks across and there's this man staring at her. And she, oh, that just kind of creeps me out. And she looks down and she starts doing her work again and she looks up again and he's gone. And day after day for a solid week, this same thing happens again and again. So she's telling her friends about this weird guy across the street. You know, he's there and then he's gone. And it wasn't too long after that she said, I gotta call the cops. So she asked the police to go and investigate. And when they did, they went into the vault room upstairs in the CIBC branch building, only to find there was no sign of someone being there. And no cobweb was disturbed. And they believe to this day that that was the ghost of Robert Service. Mr. Toastmaster.